Are we all a part of the green? And what does it mean to be in the process of becoming? Well, guys, I am really stoked for today's podcast. We're going to be talking about G. Willow Wilson's one-shot comic, Swamp Thing and Poison Ivy, the Feral Trees. I think I said that backwards. I think it's Poison Ivy and Swamp Thing. Man, it's a great show. You don't need any other comics for reference, but I do think it helps. And since you don't, we're going to have a really fun conversation getting into the weeds of like ecosystem, what it means to like care about the planet and how we're a part of the planet. What is the process of becoming? And when I'm thinking of like when I think of process of becoming, literally what happened was I was reading this comic and I took a picture and sent it to my favorite process friend, return guest, the one and only Josh Patterson. How's it going?
Woo! What's up, man? Thanks for having me back.
Yeah. And I introduced you before myself. I am the other Josh, the lesser of the Joshes. Josh Noel, one of your co-hosts here. I cheated to do this episode. So one, I saw that panel and I was like, Josh Patterson, I know you don't read comics, but this was a line in the intro of your podcast forever was none of us are, we're all in the process of becoming. And I'm like, wait a minute. I can't hear those words and not immediately be triggered to think of the better Josh. And we do comic book catch up once a month, and we let the patrons vote on one comic that we include in that whole lineup. And this was one of them that they could have chose, and instead they chose Absolute Superman. And I was like, wow, that was boring. Let's do a better comic. So now we're just doing a whole episode. So I feel like I'm supposed to be nice to my patrons. My bad, guys. But here we are. Josh, what have you been geeking out on lately?
Man. My most recent obsession has been radical theology. I've been reading a lot of it, doing a deep dive into it, trying to write from that perspective. So that's kind of definitely been a thing I've most recently been geeking out on.
Yeah, you turned me onto some of that over the summer when you connected me with, why am I struggling with the guy's name? Pirate book.
Oh, Rollins. Pete Rollins.
Yeah. Oh, man, that was fun book. Good talk. For more of that, you can go to Whole Church.
Oh, actually, hold on. Time out. Pete Rollins. I thought you said the Pyro book. You're talking about Kester Bruin. Kester Bruin did the Pirate book. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah, Kester Bruin is a radical theologian. Pete Rollins is also, and he does a thing called Pyro Theology. So that's why I thought.
What?
Yeah.
Well, I'll also be looking into that now. I wish I was better with names. I even for this, I had to write out all the names of who all was a part of the comic and
You think I didn't do that?
Perfect. Well, for me, I've been geeking out on Lower Decks is finishing up its last season. So it's the animated Star Trek series that's been going on.
Oh, cool.
It's great because it's in canon, but it also makes fun of all the other Star Trek shows. So it's fantastic. And yeah, the direction the story's going, it's a lot of fun. Not going to harp on that too much. I might be doing another episode on that soon. So,
well, I can give you something too. That's not. I'll move away from theology. I know I'm very, very late to the game, but my wife and I just watched all of Stranger Things, and I really loved it. I thought it was awesome. So I'm excited for season 5.
Man, I got to warn you, Will's going to listen to this episode because it's comics, and he loves Stranger Things. So you're probably going to get it.
Oh, nice. I'm going to get a phone call from, hey, anytime Will Rose wants to call me, he knows he's welcome.
Yeah, Will's great. Love him. I love this comic, and I'm really excited to kind of hear your perspective as someone who doesn't usually get into a lot of comics. I know we've made you read some for this show before, and I know you've read some for Ryan Doe's other podcast, Across the Bifrost. I always got to shout out Ryan. We love him in all the non-creepy ways. We love him. Yeah. I'm also going to warn everybody, there's a lot of subject matter I'm very passionate about here. My favorite author writes this comic. Some of my favorite characters are in this. So I'm just going to say we're going to, explicit warning, we will probably use stronger language than you usually hear on the show, at least sometimes.
Sorry.
Some of the stuff that happens, I can't help but get excited about. Also, rate and review the show on Podchaser if you're on your laptop. If you're on your phone, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, those are fine as well. Want to do a shout out to one of our supporters, Russell Gentry. He did not vote for the other comic, so he's the one patron I didn't offend. And with all that, we can finally get into the episode proper. So, Josh, this is one of the few comics I mentioned earlier. Your nerd friends have been making you read more comics lately for these podcasts. Could you fill the listeners in some on like what is your history? What all have you read, and what all have you been made to read recently?
Yeah, so my history is not extensive. I mean, I remember, man, explicitly there was these comics called Bone, or graphic novels, I think is the proper verbiage there, called Bone, that was kind of popular in like middle school. And so I remember snagging that because I was like, oh, it has pictures. Um, so like nothing too crazy, but I mean, I grew up liking superheroes. Batman has always been my favorite by and far. Um, and so I know like that there's the tiny connection there. I read Do a Power Bomb and did an episode about it with Will. I think I get so mixed up on all the different podcasts.
That
I
was
think
on
that
this
was a
show. Yeah,
systematic
that is this
ecology. Yeah,
podcast.
right. Okay. Yeah. So that was a lot of fun. And yeah, I did like some OG like first appearance of superheroes with Ryan, which was fun. I remember we did like Aquaman.
I'll say I think it was Aquaman. That was a good one.
Yeah, I think we did something. I want to say we did something with Superman as well. I don't remember. We did a couple. But yeah, it's not too extensive.
Yeah. Well, but like I feel like that gives an advantage though, because you read a lot of like theology and like adult people books. Like you know, like a lot of people don't think of like comics as like for adults, but some of them I would say even some of this one gets a little graphic, so I wouldn't want like a young kid reading this one. But yeah. So sometimes I feel like it helps to have like an outsider point of view of like, hey, does this comic make sense outside of like comic logic? Because you know sometimes like you pick up a Doctor Strange, and I've been reading my whole life, and I'm like, oh yeah, I know all 8 of these dimensions. This totally makes sense. And then someone else reads it, and you're like, Josh, absolutely none of that followed any kind of physics at all. You're like, oh, it's like this is so deep and meaningful. Josh, the only thing that happened was like Doctor Strange realized he's still Doctor Strange, and I'm like, well, it felt meaningful, you know. So it's nice to have that like outsider perspective from time to time, and
Hmm.
um, also, yeah, especially like comics like this, where I feel like they're not just showing like. In fact, I wouldn't even say there was a lot of action in this. There wasn't like a lot of fight
Hmm.
scenes. Like I feel like this was more of a commentary on different philosophical ideas, which is
Hmm.
where you pull in your nerd friends to talk about your geek stuff, and like if we were at Theology Beer Camp, this could be like nerd or geek stage. I feel like.
Yeah, I think it's good proof of concept, like for the intersection and crossover between the two.
Yeah. So I wasn't sure. I kind of want to get from you for someone who hasn't read a ton of these. So you read some Batman,
Mhm.
so I feel like you know who Poison Ivy is for the most part. Um, did this make sense on its own? Like I call this a one shot. So like a comic that's it's not part of a series. I feel like anyone could pick it up and it makes sense. But would you say that was the case in your experience, or?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I mean, it was easy enough for me to follow. Yeah, and I mean, I don't think it would. I agree with you. I don't think it would necessitate anybody coming in with any kind of excessive knowledge. I mean, it might be cool to know, like, oh, Poison Ivy, like to know what her powers are, because that's like a whole part of it. But yeah, I think it was fairly easy to follow, um, and enjoyable. Yeah.
Sweet. Yeah. I I also in a way, I feel like both characters got equal time, but it really felt more like a Swamp Thing comic to me, just because of like it had that kind of like horror vibe. I mean, it starts
Mm-hmm.
off with, which I hate this: the dog and the guy died. Like, you don't kill the
Yeah.
dog. Come on, that's probably the one thing that I was like, why? Why kill the dog?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, it starts off there. So really, I think the only thing you need to know. Some of the people I didn't even recognize, but it didn't really affect me because I don't follow a ton of Swamp Thing comics or anything. I know who he is. I
Okay.
know he's like a big horror comic character for DC. Um, and the dumbest reason why I don't follow him is because like I'm a big Marvel guy and I'm into Man Thing a lot, and I feel like I would get
Hmm.
the two confused too easily. So I'm
Fair
just like
enough.
I'll stay in my lane and admire this lane from a distance, you know. But yeah, by kind of rethinking some of those decisions, I'm like, this is kind of interesting. I kind of want to know more about him, like with the green and like some of his backstory. Um, I did do a little bit of research in here, and for
Okay.
me, it unpacked the story in a new light. and we'll probably comment more on this later, but I'm going to start here. So the two main characters, we have Poison Ivy and we have Swamp Thing. Poison Ivy was she had her PhD in something, but she's Pamela Lillian Isley. She was gifted her powers from the Green, and the Green in DC Comics is like kind of like a mystical force, almost like a god, where all of the plant-powered people who have passed away become part of it, and it's kind of its own entity. It is what gifted her powers. And then Alec Holland is Swamp Thing. While he was dying, the Green overtook his body and kind of kept him from dying, or replaced his body. I think it replaced his body but kept his consciousness, from what I was reading. So, that does kind of play a part when we see a character in this comics introduced where you're like, wait a minute, did she die? Or is she doing the same thing that happened to Swamp Thing? Or, is she like Poison Ivy and what could have been? And, you kind of play on that a little bit. And as we go through the story, those are the characters. This comic, I wrote down the names. So I'm going to do the names so that Will doesn't hurt me. So it is written by G. Willow Wilson, my all-time favorite author. Literally my favorite comics, my favorite novels. And even if you go into like comics, like my favorite sci-fi comic she did, my favorite fantasy comics she did, my favorite superhero comic she did, my favorite supervillain comic now she has done. So it's like she's the GOAT for me. Like I love everything she writes pretty much. Artist is Mike Perkins, and the colorist is Mike Spicer. They both work on the current Swamp Thing run together as well. So as far as like the art, it's going to look really similar to the Swamp Thing comics that have been going on. And then the letterer, I'm trying to do better at including the letterers, but I have a really hard time saying this name. So God be with me. I don't know. Hassan Otsmane-Elhaou. I could be slaughtering that. I like including the letters because, like, for me, that's like what tells my brain when I'm reading it, like, oh, this is what their voice sounds like. Like those bold, creepy letters make me feel like Swamp Thing's kind of like gurgling his voice, kind of thing. Like it helps my imagination a lot. So I want to, that I feel like that's one of those like minor roles in comics that kind of gets overlooked sometimes. But yeah,
Nice.
So all that out of the way, Josh, I've talked too much. Could you briefly kind of just unpack for people what the plot of this comic, what was this comic about?
Yeah, so I mean, like you referenced, it kind of opened up with a dog getting taken and its owner going to look for him, and the owner disappearing as well. And Ivy kind of wakes up and basically feels like the forest, the Green, whatever, is calling to her. So she goes to explore said calling, and there she runs into Swamp Thing. And the forest is kind of acting in ways that it normally doesn't. It's being a little bit more violent than usual. And Poison Ivy and Swamp Thing both kind of come to this agreement that the forest is like, I don't know, what they feel from it is not what they normally would feel from the forest or from the Green. It like feels like a different kind of energy. And ultimately, they find the source of that, which happens to be this girl. And I mean, do you want me to carry it through, or like spoiler? What's the?
Yeah. We'll just do a quick spoiler warning, and because I feel like we can't talk about the substance of this without kind of unpacking what happened.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So yeah, and ultimately, like, it turns out that this girl had some powers from the Green, and was kind of rejected. Seems like her dad was a bit of an asshole. She ended up running away, and she was actually then she became like an addict. She was living or ran away into the forest, and the forest was kind of actually protecting her as she froze to death and died in the forest. And it was her that Ivy could feel, and also that the forest was kind of protecting. And so then they kind of, it ends with Swamp Thing carrying the body of this young girl after she has died. So I think I hit all the major points.
Yeah. I almost want to say like allegedly died.
Allegedly
like,
died, right.
Just because of like how his story goes, the fact that like he was dying and the Green overtook his body and kept his consciousness kind of makes me wonder, like, if since that's his origin, if like maybe that's what's happening here. Because it is kind of weird. So like the way the story, from what I remember, it kind of unpacks like the girl who dies. Her powers are very similar to Poison Ivy's,
Mm-hmm.
but she kind of like she's rejected by everybody, so she's out here alone with the forest, and she kind of tries to trust the forest to take care of her, and then she dies. And I'm like, I don't know, like her story being that similar, but then how hard the forest was protecting her, like literally just killing things, doing shapes that nature wouldn't usually do, and they both point out like, wait a
Mm-hmm.
minute, nature doesn't do this. So it kind of makes me feel like some part of her consciousness has to still be around, right?
Okay.
So
Yeah.
maybe it ends up being like another situation. We might have to read more Swamp Thing. Maybe it ends up being like
Yeah.
another where like she turns into another, like the female Swamp Thing. You know, like there's girl Thor. Is there like a Swamp Thingette? I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know what you would call, because like that's already like a pretty gender neutral name, right? Swamp Thing. Like how would you?
Yeah. Yeah.
Or not? Yeah,
Absolutely.
I don't know. I might be reading too much into it, but I like just seeing the similarities in both Poison Ivy and Swamp Thing's origins with the girl made me go, wait a minute. I actually had to do a reread. I was like, oh, that's interesting. That's
Yeah,
weird.
there could be something there. Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Yeah, but okay, yeah. So I thought the story was really interesting. It wasn't like anything big happened. Sometimes I like when these comics do that kind of thing. I don't know how you feel about it, where it's like
Hmm.
it didn't have to be the world was about to end. You know, it could just
Right.
be there was a girl who was dying, and that's just as important.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that. I don't know. I like how, even though obviously this is based in fantasy, um it felt more grounded. Like I tend to like the more grounded superhero stuff, which is part of why I like Batman. I mean, nothing against like, end of the world or multiple dimensions or, whatever. And this
Yeah.
still has that element to it because it's Swamp Thing. Um but I like the groundedness, uh, for whatever reason, and the smaller storylines. And I think even though the main thing that happened was the alleged death of this girl, um, the way that the story's written, that is bigger than just the death of one individual, which we might talk about that later. I'm sure the interconnectedness of things, but
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, that's something. It's interesting. So, Willow Wilson, again, I have to harp on the author. She played a part in, but like not a big part. So, Miss Marvel, the character she created, recently died in Marvel Comics, and everybody kind of knew that she was going to come back. Like it was, we just knew it was going to happen. And that death, for whatever reason, felt so insignificant. Like I was like, this is
hmm,
just pointless. And it's like one of the staple superheroes, the whole world, and she dies, and I'm like, what? We know she's coming back, like whatever. And then you turn to this comic where it's like literally, I don't think the girl gets a name, or if she does, it's not like a main part of the story.
hmm,
And this random character that was just introduced dying just felt so much more significant to me. I was like, yeah,
hmm.
death matters. Maybe, maybe that's something we need to
Yeah.
keep in our stories.
Sure. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
I think so. I mean, I think particularly in the West, we do a very bad job of reconciling with death, with aging, with suffering. Um, and so I'm all for, like the Latin phrase memento mori, remember your death. That's like, I have this tattoo on my arm that's a memento mori
oh,
piece, a
that's sick.
skull with roses, and it says death will know my name. Um,
Mm,
so I think it's important
yeah,
to
yeah,
to think
yeah.
about.
No, I like that. It's Yeah, it's something I've been struggling with a lot lately. So you mentioned how like you were like nerding out on radical theology. I've been
Hmm.
getting really into metaphysics lately for some reason.
Okay,
I know
yeah,
that's like super nerdy, but I've been like,
no,
so
it's
like
good.
I started like rereading not Plato, Aristotle's Metaphysics. And then like I
Hmm.
got into like Immanuel Kant, and now I'm like there's like the great courses that's like on Audible, and I'm like going through his
Hmm.
stuff, and I'm like, I love this stuff, and like part of it is like asking this question like what it means to just simply be, what it means to exist, and that's part of
Hmm.
this comic too. So I don't feel like we're getting too off the rails here, but like understanding your own existence, like I feel like understanding death is a key part of that, right? Like if we just
Yeah.
act like death doesn't matter, then it's like, well, what does it even mean to be if death doesn't matter?
Hmm.
You know?
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I'm excited as you continue your metaphysical trajectory, eventually, hopefully you get into Whitehead, and then you can get a superior metaphysics.
Oh man, weirdly enough, what started me was it's hard to find a lot of Whitehead on Audible. So I've listened to a lot of
Oh, yeah,
audiobooks.
absolutely.
I found
Yeah.
like one that was like an abridged thing that he wrote, and I think that's what actually made me start going all the way back to Aristotle and building my way up. So maybe that's what
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
building
yeah.
to. I'm just building to go right back to Whitehead.
Yeah, and then Whitehead's just going to break everything because he's going to be like, yeah, substance-based metaphysics, not so great. Let's do event-based metaphysics instead. All right, Whitehead.
Man,
Here's a whole new
man,
metaphysical system. But
perfect. I can't wait. But yeah, it asks questions about existing and being. Before we get to that though, because I'm getting ahead of myself, I did want to stick on like the geeky comic part for our
yeah.
our audience, our main audience. Um, and I know you don't read a lot of comics, so I'm interested to see how you would do this. But if you had a rate and review, so like if you like a 0 to 10 and then like a quick, here's why I put that number on it. Where would you put this comic?
Um, I would rate it pretty high, actually. I feel like I'd give it like probably like an 8.5, maybe. Just because if I go 10, it's too high. 9 seems like I'm just the
Yeah,
new guy. So 8
I
feels
feel you.
appropriate. Um, but I think it's just, I don't know. It was the story of it was compelling. Um, there was no parts where I got bored. I really enjoyed the artwork. Um, I guess the pacing is what I was trying to say. The pacing of the comic was good. I like the overall message of the comic and the subject matter. So maybe I'm biased. But yeah, I enjoyed it. I would read it again, and I probably will. To go back and see what else I can pick up on it. So
Man, yeah, I'm also just I'm gonna be honest. I am very biased, and I think sometimes it's okay. For
yeah.
me, part of what goes into my rating is like first reading what was that experience like, because with like stories like this, a lot of it not knowing what's happening builds to the experience, so sometimes rereading it, it's
Mm,
still a good experience, but it's not the same. And my bias is I love G. Willow Wilson too much, so like I automatically anything she writes I just take more seriously, if that makes
mhm.
sense. Like a lot of
Yeah.
like I like Jed McKay. I like sorry, shout out to Ryan Doze. I love Jason Aaron, but I don't put the same weight behind those names. So when I pick up their
Mm,
comics, I'm coming at it kind of like almost cautiously, like, oh, this could go either way for me, right? And her, I'm
mhm.
picking it up and I'm immediately taking every line really serious. Like I'm all in. And I think that probably impacted my experience. So yeah, I'm biased. I'm probably gonna do like a 9.5, because A, there's that seriousness I take from the writer, and then B, there's that, yeah, what we're about to get into. I loved the messaging here. G. Willow Wilson is an American Islamic believer, and
Okay.
she writes stuff like from her perspective of faith that I'm like, yeah, that's right. Sometimes our faith really aren't that different.
Right.
Like I look at it, I'm like, yeah, in my opinion, any faith that's telling you to love others and to care for our planet and care for the good of all, I'm like, that sounds like God to me. Use a different name for your faith, for your religion, for God, even. I'm like, whatever. That sounds like God to me.
Right on, yeah.
I, I feel like if I don't get that offended when someone calls me by a different name, if they understand what I'm saying, I can't imagine that God really gives a shit either.
Yeah,
Like
right.
that's
Yes,
just me.
fair enough. Yeah, yeah.
All right. Well, do you want to get into some of the messaging? Like we both pointed out, like the message of this is part of what really drew us in. Um, well, I'll let you unpack that first, and then I'll get to specific questions. Like, what to you was the messaging of this that you were like, yeah, that's it.
Yeah, so I mean, I really like so I'm big on like ecological justice and, climate change, this kind of things matter to me. Um and so I'm big on that aspect and the kind of the uh interconnectedness that Ivy and Swamp Thing have with I want to say creation, but that's a very Christianese word. But with the environment, with the green, whatever you want to call it, was pretty cool. And I think one of the parts that I really enjoyed is there's this tension where Swamp Thing tells Ivy like that basically she has 1 foot in and 1 foot out. And Ivy's like, well, like, what do you mean? And he's saying, like, well, like, humans basically are a parasite, but you care about them. And until you care about the environment fully over humans, you're only going to be halfway in, halfway out. And Ivy kind of wrestles with that. And part of why I like that bit is because I disagree with Swamp Thing. I think Swamp Thing is wrong. I think humans grew out of the environment. Humans were not, zapped into creation, again, to use Christian language, but instead we grew out of it. In the same way that an ocean waves, the universe peoples. We are, we are the universe. We are nature becoming conscious of itself and kind of growing out of that. And so I think a lot of our ecological issues comes from when we separate those things, especially when we separate for the intention of creating hierarchy where humans are better than, I don't know, the environment or animals or however you want to put that. And so I really like that tension. That's throughout the comic. Obviously, I like all the processy language, the language of becoming, and the things not being static. And I don't know. I enjoyed the parts where they talked kind of about, towards the end when the girl dies, there was an element where they were kind of like, oh, she was alone. But I think if I remember correctly, Swamp Thing was like, well, she actually wasn't alone. She was with the forest. Like, she wasn't here alone. And so, again, I want to just reiterate that point, that as humans, we grew out of the environment and are a part of it. We're an intricate part of that system. And so when we're in nature, we aren't alone because it's our home. It's where we came from. So those were some of the core themes that I enjoyed.
Man, yeah, good stuff. Good stuff. There's a lot to unpack there. I'm gonna want to get back to each individual piece, but when you were ending, you were talking about how she wasn't alone, and that kind of how he said she was with the green or with the forest, however he worded it. The green is just such unnatural language for me to use. Ironically,
Right.
like it just feels weird. But I was actually talking about that on a podcast that we just recently recorded, Delicious in Dungeon, because I'm talking about like the importance of being thankful for your meal, all that kind of stuff. Personally, I believe in God as like both immanent and transcendent kind of deal. And part of that immanence for me, when I was talking about food, I'm like, well, that means God is in everything we're consuming. He's in the grouping we had together. So I think back to, this is kind of weird for me. I'm going to tell a story and you're going to be like, Josh, that's not what happened at all, but it's fine. After Theology Beer Camp, I think it was like the day after, but you, Kristen, Tripp, some of the other, like, to me, like the important people were hanging out having lunch somewhere, and I was about to meet up with Kristen. So I ended up like coming in at the end of lunch, and like in my mind builds this up like an anime scene where it's like you guys just had the big event and it's like that big happy meal at the end of like the arc, and then like some of the minor characters come in later, and like I came in like at the end of this meal and I'm like, hey guys, this is fun. And like, but for me, like that moment, like, yeah, it was fun, it was a good time, but also like because I over spiritualize everything, I'm like, man, that was like, here I am, eating, participating in the divine in that way, also hanging out with other humans who are also part of the divine. Like I'm like, this whole thing was like just filled with God's spirit every single part of the way. So that moment to me, even though it was kind of like a minor moment, and probably I'm the only one who was like, yeah, that was like an anime scene, but like it's still I'm like, that was such like, it's an easy moment for me to point to be like, God was there in every part of that, and it was cool. And to see this here though, like I feel like it's hard. It's easy to see that in those times. I feel like it's probably harder to see that in like a girl died by herself in a bench, freezing to death in the park. While the way Poison Ivy said it, rich millionaires sitting not far off, cozy, tearing our planet apart. And you're like, yeah, it is harder to see the green, to see the divine, however you want to word it, in those moments with her, and yet God's there because God's in everything.
Yeah, that's interesting. Because I have two. Now you have the two parts of Josh battling each other. Because I have my process side, where
two Joshes
I am
and two parts of one of the Joshes.
Yeah, it's gonna get real weird real fast. You have multiple Joshes. but so like the process side of me, um, I'm within that world of thinking. I'm a panentheist, so similar to you, it'd be both transcendence and immanence. God is in the universe is within God, or God is the universe plus something else is another way I've heard it said.
Oh, I
And
like
so
that.
like, yeah, I so there you can see it in both places. It's easier, because you can say, even though the girl on the bench who's dying alone, God is present in it through all things at all times, including within her. Um, so there's that. But then the radical theology side of me, um, would want to have a less happy reading of that and say that, in our time when we came together and we shared a meal together, right? In that event, so like in radical theology, Caputo talks about a theology of the event and says God doesn't exist, but God is an insistence. Um, and we are the ones who give existence to the divine because we exist, right? So we can actualize the divine.
Yeah.
And so when we do things that are good and beautiful and true, or sit down and share a meal together in that event, what was getting done in the name of God in that event, we actualized the divine. God was present in that meal together. But we could actually say, if we look at the other event where the girl died alone on a bench by herself, freezing, while the corporate elites were fat and happy with their millions of dollars in their warm homes, we could say that in that moment, we failed to actualize the divine and that God did not exist in that moment. Or you could even say that in that moment, God died. God died on the bench,
Mm,
is one way you could
yeah.
say it. So it's not as happy, but there's that tension there.
Yeah. And it's, again, I've been into metaphysics, so I'm getting weird, but
Yeah,
one
get
of the things
weird.
that's really helped me going through like the Great Course event that I've been listening to. Man, I'm doing like an audible advertisement. I feel like, but the
Gotta get
his
that
breaking
money,
through
bro.
like but like they break down like how like light works and how like mind-boggling it is because a lot of the tests we do prove that light cannot have a particle, but then a lot of the other tests we do prove that light absolutely has to have particles. And the same thing for wave; it has to have a wave, but it cannot have a wave. And you're like, wait, how is all this true? And I'm getting to a place more like that with God, and I'm trying to avoid like mystery language. Like I like mystery language in some instances, but like Dr.
Mhm.
Ward's brought to my attention, like sometimes that's unhelpful and even harmful to people. So I'm like, we're gonna have a debate on that at whole church recently, soon. Me and Dr. Ward about mystery
Oh,
language,
nice.
but
That's fun.
yeah, yeah. So I don't know. Like I don't want to just say it's a mystery and that's it, but I do want to say it's a mystery and we have more to learn. We can learn it. I don't think it's unlearnable, but that doesn't mean it's also not a mystery, right? And I think both things are true. Looking at this event and trying to think if I want to go there, I do want to go there. Thinking about my own life, right? There was recently a shooting that
Hmm.
my wife got grazed by a bullet, my dog got shot in the face, and I'm like, for me, that challenged a lot of my theology, and I'm still challenging it. I have a paper that I keep editing like every week where I'm like, God is in everything. Does that mean God was in that bullet and in those people who decided
Mm.
to do that? I'm like, actually,
Hmm.
kind of hate that idea, right? Like that sounds
Yeah.
kind of awful. Um, but then also like God not being there at all. So my wife and dog would have died alone if they died. I don't love that either.
Hmm.
Then like radical theology kind of helps a little bit. But then I'm like, wait, in what way could my dog have actualized the divine? I don't think he could have, right? So I'm like, no, that doesn't really, like all the theology, like I love all of it. I struggle to find the answer that like helps, and I think sometimes it's okay to say like I want to keep learning, but some instances I just need to sit in it, and that's what
Hmm.
one thing I love that this comic does. They don't give you like an answer at the end, right?
Hmm.
The ending, Swamp Thing's like that's the difference. I chose the forest, you chose the girl.
Hmm.
And it doesn't say, and here's what you should have chose.
Yeah.
Like there's not like a narrator's thing at the bottom, like here was the right answer. And I'm like, that's life though, right? Like I can choose to, and this is like where I struggle because I've been leaning more into universalism, and
Hmm.
and part of me now wants to do like a caveat of like, yeah, but maybe there's hell in the meantime. So those people who shot my dog can go to hell for a while, and then maybe later, like
Yeah,
I
yeah.
kind of do like the idea to be punished, but at the same time, I'm like, at the same time, there is this beautiful image of like one day them no longer being themselves, having become one with the divine. I'm able to, and C.S. Lewis talks about a lot about like the power of imagination, and I think that's helpful to imagine a world where maybe this isn't how the afterlife works at all. That those same people are able to come pet the dog, love the dog, and because my dog is my dog, he's a loving, kind, forgiving animal. He's like, oh, cool, throw me a stick, right? And I'm like I'm of two minds. On the one hand, I'm like, I kind of do want them to go to hell, and I mean that. And then on one hand, I'm like, but man, it's a much more beautiful image to think of this other thing. And can I bring myself to accept that image given the darkness that was there? I don't know. So I just kind of had to sit in it, I guess.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there's wisdom in sitting in things, as you're putting it. Because this, I mean, essentially what we're talking about is the problem of evil, which is often referred to as the perennial problem of evil, because it's a question that people have been asking since freaking forever, and we probably are going to continue to do so. I mean, that's how I got into open and relational theology, and then process thought was the problem of evil. And then I had my world rocked and shattered and challenged when I started reading anti-theodicy or anti-theodicy. My friend Annie Day Rolfe, she brought that to my attention. I recorded an episode with her about it. Then I read a book on pantheologies by Mary Jane Rubenstein that talks about it in a whole different way. Then I read Radical Theology. And so I think and this feels so weird for me to say, but I think the pastoral side of me is recognizing that these different ways of speaking can be helpful at different times in people's lives. Like there are some people who, when they experience tragedy, offering them an open and relational perspective on it would be helpful and spiritually nourishing. But there are others who that would not be the case. And to provide such a thing could be spiritually harmful or damaging. And in the same way, there are people who radical theology works, or pantheism works, or Calvinism, gross, works. But
Yeah.
but I wouldn't want to take that away from people. And so I think the willingness to sit in the tension is good, and I think healthy overall. I don't really know if there are too many answers.
Yeah. And I wouldn't be one to say that there's no such thing as like capital T truth or anything like that, or however you want to word it. I just feel like in some instances where we don't know what it is, maybe it's okay to let people have a little bit of ambiguity and use what's helpful to them, For me, what's funny is like, I tried a bunch of this stuff, right? Like I thought about Dr. Ord because I was like, oh yeah, all these testimonies where that helped him. And I was like, open and racial. I'm like, wait a minute. So these guys just choosing not to work with the divine, and then no one in our area did decide to work with the divine. So this just happened. I'm like, I don't like that either. Weirdly enough, for me, it was a graphic novel. I picked up the graphic novel, the Tao Te Ching. Sometimes I call myself a Christian Taoist, and I'm reading this, and I'm like, I didn't change any theology or anything like that. I just thinking of it instead of like, for some reason, using the God language, I envision like the big guy upstairs, even if I don't try to envision that, like some part of me still holds on to that. So then when instead you're talking about the Force and the Tao, it's easier for me to reconcile using those languages, even if I still mean God by it, because I'm not envisioning that big guy in the sky. Which maybe gets us back to the green. Getting into what, like, I feel like we strayed a little bit, but it's all relevant to what they're talking about.
Yeah, I think it's all here.
Yeah. One of the things you mentioned, I'm going to go back through a few things. You talk about like this first tension we see. And from my understanding, and I don't remember, Swamp Thing and Poison Ivy had some kind of relationship before. I don't know if they were like romantically involved or if he was like a mentor to her or like what happened. Poison Ivy is a Batman villain usually just because she's an eco-terrorist. She sees someone doing bad stuff to the planet, so she's like, you know what, I'm going to F up those humans. So it's always kind of like, is she really a bad guy? I've always kind of had that. And then Swamp Thing is like a monster who's punishing people for destroying the forest, and he is one with the forest. And it's kind of like, what, is that really a monster though? And then he fights other monsters that are taking it a little too far, and you're like, oh, okay, I see what's happening here. So to see them have this tension here, one who has physically died and whose consciousness has become one with the green, and the other one who's physically still there that has been gifted with powers from the green, which the green is like their way of talking about nature, whatever. To having this conversation where it's like his thing is screw humans, it's all about nature, and her thing is humans are part of nature. And I'm with you. I think Swamp Thing's wrong. Like, but it's hard to envision that because like when I think of like this plastic bottle, I don't think of that as nature, but like realistically, it's made up of all stuff that we find in the universe, and us as humans who are natural things created it. So it's kind of like, at what point do I draw the line? You know, like it feels weird to be like, this all natural microphone. It's like, what, Josh? What? Like,
Right.
so where do we draw the line of like nature or the green, and then like other stuff? I guess.
I mean, I guess it's going to become more and more difficult over time, but I think one way to think about it is like organic is like life, like organism, or like we are organic beings that grew out of the dirt. And so are trees and animals and birds and worms and,
Can I challenge
little
that?
bacteria. Yeah, go for it.
I'm gonna be super obnoxious here because I still feel
Do
like
it.
we think of like rocks that aren't organic as nature, and
Mm-hmm.
then like
Mm-hmm.
our good old friend Elon Musk discovered all this, or it wasn't really him, but whatever. He's associated with some of the discoveries of like these silicone chips, right, where we use this sort of carbon adjacent stuff. We're using trees to create these microchips in computers, and I feel like we would more easily call rock part of nature than we would those computer chips made of tree.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I guess maybe because like the rock is naturally occurring. I don't know. I haven't
Yeah, I
thought
don't
about
know
this
either.
too much. Yeah. Because there are like rocks, and then also too, like I can really jack it up because if you talk about metaphysics, I'm a pan experientialist, meaning that I think consciousness is ubiquitous in the universe. It goes all the way down. Um, and I prefer, so that's often called panpsychism. I prefer pan experientialism because I would rather say experience is ubiquitous, because I think consciousness confuses people into thinking that I'm saying the rock is conscious, and if I kick it, it's now sad at me because I was a jerk to it.
Yeah.
But what I'm actually saying is that when it gets down to the smallest things that make up the universe, the experience of that thing is not zero. There are some, elements of experience there, which science is coming around to. Panpsychism is really having a heyday right now in philosophy of mind.
Oh yeah.
And so that kind of ties in more to the interconnectedness of things.
Yeah. Well, it's where like
So,
it's where a lot of science, metaphysics, and spirituality kind of have been getting like so close it's hard to distinguish too, because you have stuff like what you're talking about, like consciousness, and we used to think of like a soul as a separate thing, and that maybe our mind is related to our brain, but they're separate. But then like we see where like the stuff that we think of someone's mind, like their personality, the stuff like we consider part of their spirit. Well, something happens to their brain, and all that stuff changes. So we're like, well, are we just like brains and physical bits? And then it's like, what does that even mean? And if God is in all things, does it really matter? And then like you get to like that, and then you think of how, especially my fellow high Christologist, yeah, maybe that's the right way of saying that. You think of like the fact that Jesus had to be all man and all God, but if God is in all things, what's that even mean in the first place? And then even if he's not, at what point like was it like when he was first conceived that he became all God? Like what point in the womb, or was it like before then? Was it like the sperm, or was it like the stuff that Joseph ate that eventually became the sperm? Like where do you draw this line of like when Christ imbued the organism that became Jesus?
yeah. Yeah, I mean, can I give a process answer? My process
I love
perspective
it.
on the
Yes.
Christology question? Okay.
Yes.
This is how I think when I have to think about it. So within a process perspective, God is present in and through all things at all times, calling us, inviting us, provoking us, luring us forward into the good and beautiful and true, right? And in each moment of our becoming, we have the ability to give in to that call or to reject it. And you and I maybe say we're on a good day, we were like an 8 out of 10, right? Like, oh man, today Joshua really gave in to the divine lure. He was loving everybody and blah, 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 blah. 8 out of 10, so cool. But Jesus, on the other hand, Jesus of Nazareth was so in tune with the divine lore, with the divine call, that Jesus actualized those things in every moment of Jesus's becoming, to the point that Jesus literally becomes the image of the invisible God. Because Jesus, through his life, is literally incarnating the divine will in each moment of his becoming. And so Jesus is turned up to like 11, where we're like maybe an 8 on a good day. And so that's not like, you're going to have some Orthodox people get pissy with me about that. But
yeah, well, and that's where like I find that really alluring, because it makes sense. Like when I have to think about like the physics of it all, I'm like that helps make sense of it. But then like I do struggle with the whole, and it's maybe it's because I'm holding to too much of a high Christology, where I'm like, but Jesus had to have all the same experiences of us. So at some point in that line, he wasn't fully God, so he wasn't God having the same experience as us. And I'm like, how does? But then if God is in all of us, he's having all of our experiences. For me, I think some of it gets out of my wheelhouse, which is why I'm studying metaphysics, because I hope to understand. I'm in the process of understanding.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's confusing, especially too when you get into, and like the metaphysics is going to be big here, because when you get into like typically the formulations of like Christ as fully human and fully God is based upon substance-based metaphysics. You are arguing over of what substance is Jesus and of what substance is God, and how are these two substances somehow existing together both at the same time when substances can't do that. So like that's a metaphysical debate that is being hashed out with theological language, which is just what we do. And so within the process perspective, you lose that. You don't have a substance-based metaphysics, so you don't have to make those kind of arguments. It's event-based. And then when you get into things like dual aspect monism, which is typically the metaphysics of choice for process people, where mind and matter, spirit and matter, however you want to call it, they are not two separate substances. They're not just collapsed in on each other, but rather it's dual aspect monism. They're two sides of the same coin. Each particle or little thing, whatever, has both a spiritual and a material side. I don't know. This is just nerd stuff now.
Yeah. I mean, I follow you. I honestly, I thought all of those kind of stuff that you guys would talk about, I was like, man, they're just making too much out of all this. They're thinking too hard. And then like I start doing some of the studies, and I'm like asking questions, and I'm like, wait a minute. But I don't think when someone gets dementia that they stop being their same soul, and yet their personality sometimes does change. And I'm like, I think though, DC presents a different problem in their comics, because they don't have like a god, right? So like the green is like the god of nature, and then like they have other gods. So I feel like it presents a different problem, because in here it's like, well, where do you draw the line of what is the green or what is nature? We don't have to have the problem. Everything's from God, right? Like, whatever. So I don't think we need to face that problem, but it does bring up some interesting questions. And it's where I love Poison Ivy's like, but wait a minute, we're part of this whole system. And that goes back to me being the Christian Taoist weirdo who like loves the Tao language, because I feel like that is like for me, where I draw the line to like nature or not nature is probably like, are we in tune with the rhythm, in tune with the force that is God, that is moving things, or are we fighting against it? Like I feel like some of human creations are fighting against the current, moving against the current. Yes. Or for DC Comics, I feel like it's maybe we're part of the green when we're working with the green, but when we're working against the green, we're no longer part of the green. Maybe it's a choice of like whether or not we want to be in tune with God or the green, or pick your thing here depending on what universe we're talking about.
Yeah, well, like in my current line of work, like we do so I'm a hazard mitigation project officer, and all that think of me as like a project manager who helps local communities assess hazards, most of the time environmental hazards, so like flooding, right?
Sick, by the way.
And then come up with projects to prevent that from happening or lessen the impacts when it does. So like our two priorities, protecting life first, and then protecting property second. And so why was I talking about this? So anyway, a big part of what we do are called environment-based solutions, or nature-based solutions rather. And the whole point of that is that we are saying, okay, a lot of this problem was caused because humans came along and we fucked with how nature works. And then it responded negatively.
Preach.
Wow, that's weird. And then we're saying, what can we actually learn from nature? How can we give into the rhythms, the flow of nature, so that this kind of settles back out? And so that's like a huge, well, at least it exists right now. I don't know with our soon-to-be president if things like that are going to continue to exist, because he's threatened to make them not exist anymore. But working with nature is like a real thing that exists in the world, and I think we need to do more of.
Yeah.
End of rant.
And I
Sorry.
agree with you. Also, that's a super cool job, and I would love to learn more. That's so cool. And I'll be the weirdo who I don't think like every time we're not working with nature isn't necessarily bad. I'm glad to have this microphone. I don't mind using this microphone.
Yeah.
I do not think we were trying to be one with nature when we created the microphone. So I would say nuance for sure, but I think more times than not, like the best we can do to align ourselves with the force, the green, whatever, I think the better, the more eco-friendly the creation of a microphone is, the more likely I am to want to use it personally, it's why for a long time I wanted to be cremated, and now I can't do that because of the environmental harm it causes. So now I'm like I've literally been writing to my senator because I really want to be composted, but in most states that's not legal. And I'm like, well, I would like to change that. Like, it's such a minor issue that I've just decided I feel like this is nonpartisan enough that maybe if I bug people enough about it, we could do something here. But that's how like I would like to be one with the green, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, that's like a very, I was going to say Christian, but that's actually a very Jewish idea, right? Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. Like, from ashes you came, into ashes you shall return. Like in Genesis, you literally, well, I think it's in Genesis 2, the one where God's a bit more involved, where you have God literally scooping up the dirt, forming it, and breathing ruach, spirit, life into it. It's where I came from, dude. I'm kind of down to go back,
Yeah. All just part of that system, all the same flow. So you also mentioned, and it's kind of on the slide if people can read, Poison Ivy is really concerned about this human, about what's going on, about someone being in pain. And Swamp Thing kind of makes the statement of how, like, because she's like, wait a minute, I'm not all in or all out. Like, I like humans too. And he says, well, we're all in the process of becoming. And that's the thing that I sent you the picture, and I was like, wait a minute. I don't think it's in your intro now, but it used to be Rethinking Faith. You used to have that in your intro where you're like, we're all in the process of becoming. Do you want to just kind of unpack that statement, what you mean by it, and what you think maybe was meant in the comic, and whether it's the same thing or different?
Yeah, so absolutely. You are right. I don't say it in the intro anymore, because as much as I love that phrase, I say it all the time on the podcast, but as much as I love that phrase, I was informed by some people that they were like, that's kind of weird to some people and they don't know what that means. So maybe it limits who'd be willing to listen if you lead with that. It's like, okay. I'll just wait 2 seconds into the podcast and say it.
Perfect.
But what I mean by that we're all in the process of becoming is that we're not static creatures. You and I are constantly changing, physically, like biologically, like our cells are dying and like new ones are taking their place. But also our experiences impact each other. So I am not the same Josh that I was 55 minutes ago when we started this conversation, because I've had this experience with you now, where that has now impacted me and who I am. I'm no longer the same Josh as I was even then. So I think it's an illusion to assume that we are static. Which also this gets into your metaphysics, dude, because
perfect.
yeah. Yeah, I don't think we're static. Everything is constantly changing. Everything is always in process. Like there's that old proverb where they say, you can't step in the same river twice because the river's always flowing, right? Um, and then a process person might argue and say, yeah, well, I don't even think you can step in the same river once because you yourself are not a static being. There is not like this static thing called Joshua Patterson, but rather I am a process. I'm made up of organic processes. There's like an entire community of like bacteria and stuff that lives inside of my body that's keeping me alive. Like where does Josh start versus where does Josh end? This is all really interesting stuff. So that's what I mean by that. We're in the process. But also I mean that because my podcast is theological, philosophical in nature, I mean that from a spiritual perspective as well. Like, I think a static faith is a dead faith. Like
Yeah.
I view the spiritual experience more as a journey. Um, as I continue to walk through life and I learn new things and I experience new things, and I experience the divine in new ways, I personally believe that my faith should be able to reflect that, that it should change over time. Um, and I know this is where people will start to argue with things like, but God doesn't change and like capital T truth doesn't change. Um, I would argue and say God does change. God is in the process of becoming with us as well. But also, I would grant someone, say, even if capital T truth exists, you and I don't have access to it. Like everything, this is also part of the becoming thing. Like everything is conditioned. All of our language is conditioned. And once we start trying to explain something that is ultimate, like God or capital T truth, as soon as we apply language to it, we are conditioning the unconditional. So it's a construct. That's all philosophically, that's all deconstruction means, is recognizing things are all constructed, they can be deconstructed. And so it's all a process. It's a way of being in the world. So those are a few thoughts.
Oh yeah. And I want to get how you think that compares to like what they say in the comic. But
Yeah.
just a quick
Sorry.
couple things, just for listeners, because whatever. I love everything Josh said. I probably worded it a little bit different just because for me, I am not convinced that time is real. I'm a weirdo. I'm kind of with Immanuel Kant on that, and I'm like, time maybe exists, but I would say our experience is constantly in a process of becoming. Because whether or not I think time is real, I'm certainly experiencing something that I call time. So
yeah,
I might as well stick to that language and be less confusing. Yeah,
I like the pragmatism.
I also just really think that like that's like perfect for a podcast because like doing whole church and I listen to like old things. I mean, I don't believe that at all. It would have been great if in my tagline I said I'm constantly in a process of changing my mind.
Yeah,
But it's like
I think it's just
now.
honest.
Yeah,
I think it's just. I mean, I think too, like, because I think back to, man, like there's old episodes of Rethinking Faith. Back when it was Theology Doesn't Suck, but even when it was Rethinking Faith, where like I listen to it and it's like I cringe. I'm like, oh, gross. What is this nonsense?
Oh, man. There's even
I hope
guests that
no
I'm
one
like, why did I let
ever
him on?
listens to this. Correct. Yes. But at the same time, that's all a part of the process. And like, I need to recognize that past Josh was doing the best that he could with what he knew at the time. And I need to have compassion and grace for past versions of Josh, because without that past version of Josh, I wouldn't be who I am today. And so
And I just
that's
hope you
all a
also
part
have
of the
compassion and
process.
grace for my past Josh.
Yeah, of course. Yeah,
Yeah.
we have to. I think learning to have learning to have compassion for ourselves and past versions of ourselves should in turn give us compassion for others, right? Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Again, that assumes
Anyway,
the past exists. But
right.
no, but the yeah. So I
My
feel like you unpacked
experience
that
of the
pretty well.
past.
Yeah. Oh man. So how do you think that compares to what Swamp Thing means when he uses literally the exact same language? He verbatim says, "We're all in a process of becoming," and I'm like, this begged for Josh Patterson to be on the show.
Yeah, I mean, I think like he's recognizing again. I think he agrees that this human life form is not static. And we kind of get this towards the end where he makes comments about death and death not being the end and these kind of things. I think he recognizes that this particular person or life embodied in this person's existence um isn't static, that like she's going to die and she's going to return to the green, or she's, whatever. And so it's not this either or, it's not binary. It's constantly always in process, and like, the cells from her body can return to the green and become a tree, or the nutrients can, become whatever. And so I think it's just a recognition of like, I don't know, go into Lion King. It's the circle of life, these kind of things.
For Will,
But
we
I
could
think,
say entangled theology.
yeah. So,
Yeah.
that's, I don't know. I don't have much to add. I'm curious what you think Swamp Thing means.
I know. I just agree with you. And then
Sweet.
like in December, an embarrassing amount more of who I am will be made up of cells that used to be turkey. Like that's just a fact of life. So like, why bother denying it? But at the same time, I feel like that should give us, and it's why I love that this comic revolves so much around death. Is like it should give us a new respect for death. Like when I think about like how much of me is about to be a turkey that might be alive right now when we're recording this. Like that's kind of humbling, right? Like we are so intimately connected. Even if you take God out of it, just the intimate level of connection we all have with like nature, what we eat, where we go when we die, like all this stuff, like take the afterlife, all the spiritual stuff out of it. Like that connectivity is still something that I think is powerful, and gives death meaning.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's you're describing transcendence. Because transcendence doesn't always necessarily have to be like, God out there or something like that. But recognizing that you are part of something bigger than yourself, that is a transcendent experience, which I think is cool. So I'm here for it. I also think too, darn it, I had a thought and it disappeared. So
I love when that happens.
Oh, got it. I I like the ending too, because where he ties in this process of becoming stuff, where he talks about death as a beginning. Because oftentimes people will say something like, "Oh, well, life implies death," which I guess is true. But also, it's fun to flip that and say, "Oh, well, what if it's actually death that implies life?" And there's this thing called the wisdom pattern that tons of spiritual writers have written about, and it's often called different things. You can find it within like native and indigenous spirituality, and they'll often point to the changing of the seasons. In Christianity, it's called life, death, resurrection. And so there is this pattern. And oftentimes, I mean, death or life comes from death. Like death is necessary for new life to be created, in how this world is set up and structured. So that's interesting.
Yeah. No, I mean, I agree. And I really like the way, like that you phrase that, like, what if death implies life? Just that question. I feel like it's so powerful. And yeah, like there's so much to say about death and how like the ending of this works. Sorry, I'm almost at a loss for words. Like for me, and I'll go to something metaphysics before I go back to the comic, because apparently we just decided to do a metaphysics comic episode. I don't know, but like just the idea of like I'll use myself because I feel like that's slightly less morbid if I use my own dead body, for example, right? Like you see me here, and like clearly people would say, "Oh, that's Joshua," right? Like I'm here. But then like I die, and let's say that they have like a viewing for me, even though hopefully I get to be compost, but whatever. They have a viewing, and like you look, and like the amount of people who would see that dead body there and still say that's Joshua, probably a little less, but a lot of the same cells are there, right? Like the same stuff that made me up is there. Even like if you point to like, oh, this personality or this trait or like the way Josh always said this or whatever, it's like, well, all of that was programming that's in the brain there. It's like it's still there. It's just not doing anything right now. But like, are you still willing to say that's Joshua? And then let's say I get my dream and I'm composted. I don't think the amount of people who look at that dirt and be like, oh, that's Joshua. Probably even less, right? Right?
Yeah.
Like it's like, oh, I don't want to say Josh is dirt. But then let's say, because I feel like TJ might be the one friend that's able to do this without being creeped out by it. He plants a tree in the dirt that was Joshua, right? And like the seed takes in those nutrients and it grows. In a weird way, I feel like more people are able to say, that's Joshua to the tree, that I'm part of that tree, than they would be probably the dirt or even the dead body. Probably still a lot less than who would look at me right now and say that's Joshua. But you know what I'm saying? Like when life occurs again, I feel like it becomes easier for the human mind to go, oh yeah, something about Joshua is in that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think so. I think that connection there, because I mean, especially too, like, you know, people often as well will say things like, I don't know, like I have family members, Noel, my partner, her grandmother passed away, geez, I guess almost 3 years ago now. And anytime that there's like, we see like a hawk or like a bird comes and visits, they'll be like, oh, that's Nanny. And so like there is something to that, to the idea of recognizing someone you once knew as alive with things that are alive, and not inert, which I think goes to the point of like I think people recognize inherently that we are not static beings, because when you're dead and laying in a casket like that, even though you can see biologically like, okay, you know, whatever, maybe the cells or whatever, like we just inherently know that people are becoming, that they're not static.
Yeah. And I'm not trying to like make a case for incarnation or reincarnation or anything like that. I'm just saying like,
sure. Yeah, me neither.
like I'm just philosophically, I feel like there is something about us that we recognize is meant to be alive. And I think that's what's happens in the story where like we see this girl and we're like, she was meant to be alive. And that, I did not mean to do this transition, but I'm proud of it. That gets to like Poison Ivy's reaction, right? She's at the end and she goes, wait a minute, that's not how this was supposed to end. Because you remember the beginning, like they get this mysterious call from deep within the forest. And it's like imagine like you literally hear God's voice and like you answer the call, you go to where he sends you. And the whole point was to find someone dead. It's like, what am I supposed to do with that? You know, like what? Like I related so much to her in that moment. Like, what the hell you mean that this is it? Like, it's just a dead person? Like, the whole story, like, you called us out from, like, a supernatural entity calls us out from bed. Like, she's at home with her girlfriend, like, living a peaceful life, and gets woken up and called into the forest just to find a dead girl. And you're like, that's not how this is supposed to end. And, like, I related so much. Like, I was like, yeah, right? Like, that's hard.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree. And I think too, that just goes back to a point that we made earlier about us we're just not good at dealing with death. I think maybe there could be some commentary there from the author kind of pointing us in that direction, because it's like, yeah, it's making death the point of this story, and with that kind of supernatural calling, it's recognizing that death is sacred, in the same way that life is sacred. Death too is sacred. But I don't know. I mean, you have this final panel up, which is, I think this is my favorite panel in the comic. And it starts out with Swamp Thing saying, "The green is a perspective." And I like that because that's how I think about a lot of my theology and my metaphysics, even like process, is a way of explaining the world that just happens to work for me. But it's a perspective. It's I don't hold it very tightly. You know, I hold it more loosely. It gets into like within radical theology and theopoetics. Which again, it's that perspective. And just like deconstruction isn't something that happens once or that you do, but rather deconstructive is a way of existing in the world. It's a perspective. So anyway, I like that aspect in that last panel there.
Yeah, it's actually funny. Like, I feel like you can use biblical language to explain deconstruction and make it more palatable. Because it's like, really, all deconstruction is dying to yourself, right? Like, like, are we supposed to die to ourselves daily? Like, deconstruction is something I'm constantly doing. I'm always rethinking my beliefs. And The ones that stay are usually God exists, God is love, and
Hmm.
yeah. But that doesn't mean I don't question that daily, because if God's real, I should have no fear of questioning Him, right? Like, anyway, um, you
Yeah,
know,
yeah. No, I feel you, dude. And I think like for me, because and this kind of gets into why I love that idea, the green as a perspective. Um, is I would make a distinction between faith and belief. Um,
yeah,
like but when I would say that saying the green as a perspective is a faith statement, not a belief one. Um, I most of the time I don't know what I believe. That's always changing.
yeah. I mean,
Um,
that's yeah, fair.
but faith, I have, you know, like Aaron Simmons, philosopher, he's been to beer camp.
Love that
He
guy.
describes faith as risk in a direction. And um I love that because I don't know if there's a God. I hope there is. I really do. I feel like I experience God sometimes. But I'm going to risk myself in the direction that there is a God and that God is love, and I'm going to live my life accordingly. Which that's all faith. That's all faith. There's no belief in there for me because I don't know what I believe. It's a perspective. It's a way of existing in the world, risking myself in the direction of love. Um, because when I contemplate my finitude, the fact that one day I too shall die, living a life of love seems worthy of that recognition of my finitude. So
Yeah.
that's
Well, yeah, and that gets a lot to like how I think about missiology and what it means to be Christ in the world too. Because
hmm,
for me, I'm not sure about any belief. I'm not sure that I exist, especially after doing some metaphysics. Right? I'm like, what is Josh? Right? But like at the same time, what I am sure of is, regardless of what is true, I believe that living a life as if God exists, as if love is the ultimate principle of reality,
mhm.
creates better results. So, like in
Yes.
my mind, I know this is crazy, but like if I live this way and I'm wrong, I still feel like I lived a better life. So I don't really care if
Mhm.
I'm wrong. And that
Yeah.
also gets to like the Christians who are assholes, right? Like, because they're so convinced that God is real in their belief that they're willing to do anything to make other people believe like them. But I'm like, okay, but at the end of the day, if you're wrong, I feel like you wasted your life.
Mm.
Whereas if you did the same thing and you loved people and you said, hey, here's what I believe, and you just kind of had these real conversations, well, you know, that little tweak in missiology, I don't think that even changing the belief, but I feel like that tweak in how you respond to people and live out your life changes it from where, like, if you're wrong, I still feel like that's a life worth living. So I feel like that's kind of just how we think about everything. So when we think of like ecology and the green, if I'm wrong about it being God being real and my duty to being help this planet, I helped the planet. Cool. You know, like,
Yeah.
and if I'm right, even cooler. So like that
Yeah.
that's just like how I think about a lot of this. Um, and yeah, just I don't know. A lot of the times, stories ending this way can be aggravating, and I can
Mm.
see where the stories might continue. Where like Poison Ivy is going to struggle with, she could have been that girl on the bench, right? That had the same power. She could die alone,
Yep.
and I could see that struggle going on. That makes me kind of curious what's going to happen in those comics, and I could also see Swamp Thing, especially if this girl becomes like him and has a consciousness that's but one with the green, and it's like, what does he do with that? Like I'm actually curious on like how the story continues, and usually I'm not at the end of stuff like this. I'm like, that was cool, and I can leave it. But
Yeah.
I think death gave it the weight it needed for the story
Mm.
to be interesting to see what happens next. You know,
Yeah.
and that's hard to do because usually death is like a story's over, right? But yeah, and there's plenty of
Right.
stuff we could probably keep talking and like parsing back and forth on this.
Yeah. Yeah, dude. I mean, I agree. I think death did provide like I like how you said that the kind of proper weight to it. Um, Especially as you mentioned earlier in a comic that didn't have like a million fighting scenes or something like that. Um, but I think I don't know. I like the weight of it there, and I'm was curious. I was just like playing around in my head with your idea of this girl potentially coming back or something like that. Um, which is, I mean, one that I find interesting because if you think about it like metaphorically and like, okay, so, um, this girl died. One could argue that it was because of a lack of care from the powers that be, society, the system,
Mhm.
capitalism, whatever. Um, And she could come back kind of seeking revenge almost, right? As a part of the green, kind of reclaiming what was hers. And I think that's a real phenomenon that people have to wrestle with and reconcile with. Like, as much as I think people grew out of creation and that we should work with it, also humans have done really bad things to the earth and are kind of parasitic.
Yeah.
And so when the human race dies off, which in my opinion, it inevitably will, the earth is going to keep on keeping on, and it will have its quote unquote revenge, if you want to call it that. And so I think that's just something that's always interesting to contemplate. Just, I don't know, for anybody, but also like if you're a theological person, put that in your pipe and smoke it. Like, that's a doozy.
Yeah, no, for sure. And it gets, especially since you said revenge. I have like two last questions and we can wrap this up. But
Cool.
it goes to he talks about revenge because she's so pissed off. She's like, here's this girl who was just all she wanted to be was one with nature, who dies alone in the park when these rich assholes, are like up in these mansions tearing the universe apart because they're like doing oil rigs, whatever else. They don't give a shit what happens to the planet. And she's pissed off and she's like, I want revenge. How do you not want revenge? How are you just, because Swamp Thing's just like, yep, this is what happened. And she's like, why aren't you pissed off? And it's funny because like I so get both perspectives, right? Right? Because like on the one hand, I'm like, yeah, I'm kind of pissed off too. Let's go get them. Like, let's start some, like, for me, like, I don't want to be an eco terrorist like Poison Ivy, but I'm like, let's start some campaigns. Let's do something. Let's like it makes, that's the part of me that actually wants to get involved with politics because I'm like, no, like fuck those guys, right? Like let's do something about this. Then on the other hand, I feel him where I'm like, you know what? One with spirit. God is love. The universe is things. She's now one with the universe. Let's kind of like part of my Taoism stuff that I've been into. I'm like, yeah, okay, I feel that, and then like I feel both. And he asked this question on the last panel, and what he says is like, because she wants revenge. He's pointing that this is why she wants revenge, is because all throughout the comic you see Poison Ivy, she touches the vines and she sees this girl suffering, so she's fighting through the forest to get to the girl. She wants to save the girl. And Swamp Thing's like, yeah, it's all nature, it's all fine, and he's just kind of along for the ride almost. And it's one where he said, what the reason you want revenge is because you chose the girl. I chose the forest. And I guess like that would be my question, Josh. Like, would you choose the girl or do you choose the forest? Like where are you on like how he ends this?
Oh man, I don't know. I mean, I think as a human, I would probably, if I had to choose, go more with Poison Ivy and choose the person. But also, I don't know if it's a genuine choice. I don't know if it has to be one or the other.
Ooh, yeah, false dichotomy. Here we go.
Yeah, I think that it's too deeply connected. Like, let's put it out of the comic and into like today when we talk about like, one of the biggest concerns that people have about environmental based solutions or like doing things to help take care of the environment is that it costs money. And that's going to make us sad because we want to have our money to, I don't know, go watch football or something.
Yeah.
Which in a way you're choosing people and comfort over the environment, but at the same time, by denying these things, you're not choosing people, because like we kind of need the fucking environment to live. Like oxygen, really good thing, ozone layer, pretty sweet. Like the things that help keep us and sustain us is the environment. So I don't know how like choosing between the two, I think is false. And I think that's something that people need to come to a recognition of, is that we are deeply interconnected, deeply interwoven. And also for the money people, when you don't invest in climate-based or environmental-based solutions now and don't get ahead of things, don't mitigate your hazards, it ends up costing you significantly more money down the road. Significantly more. Like even over the course of 10 years, it's like billions of dollars. If you would have just mitigated the hazard prior, rather than letting it go. So I think it's a false choice.
Yeah, I think I'm with you. I think I'm with you. Because what what I'm brought to think about is a couple things. One is like sustainability, just in general, right? And I mentioned this on a recent podcast too. I don't know why I'm harping on it. I think it was the gray wolves in like southern Western America. There was some kind of predator like that they wanted to reintroduce. If you reintroduce too many at once, everything dies. That's bad. But them being taken out of the system caused a lot of things to die, which is also bad. Like you need the predator for the cycle to continue. So you have to like slowly reintroduce them, which is why we need AZA accredited zoos to do this research, to habitat the animals until we can reintroduce them, all that kind of stuff, right? And it's where it's like people hate zoos. And I'm like, okay, but without some of these zoos, we literally cannot do what we need to do for some of these sustainability efforts. Like we have to have that. And I hate to be the person who's like both sidesing. You know, I'm not trying to both sides. We're trying to like everybody's guilty. And let's just figure out what way we want to be guilty. You know, because like even a lot of the super environmental politicians, I'm gonna go with that. You have a lot of people who are like, oh, we're going to get rid of fossil fuels, all this stuff out of America. And all they really mean is that we're going to be doing green stuff here and then ship our needs for the other things to another country that's actually going to be doing it worse for the environment. You know, like oil rigs in other countries are not as clean as the ones here. So it's kind of like, I don't want them at all. But if we're going to have them, let's be honest that we have them and not, you know, trust someone that we know we can't trust to do it, maybe. So like, I do feel like there's a lot of nuance in the fact that we good guy, bad guy, everything, or make everything like a dichotomy, kind of takes away our responsibility because we could just say those guys are at fault. The millionaires are at fault, not us. Or you know what I mean? Like othering people kind of helps us, takes away the actual responsibility and the stuff that might actually help us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think part of like the language I would use to describe what you're talking about is like harm reduction, which I think is a super helpful tool way of looking at things. Because so often we are taught, especially within the politics in this country, where everything is so divided that everything is a zero-sum game. You either win or you lose. You're the good guy or the bad guy. When in reality, things are never that simple. And harm reduction is a far better, in my opinion, strategy. How can we reduce harm, you know, step by step? We don't need to get the whole thing, right? Like an example would be like some theological harm reduction. There's a guy, oh my goodness, what's his name? His book is over there.
I feel like I know what you're about to say, and I can't remember either.
He's an ethicist. He wrote the new. It's a whole ethics book about the New Testament. Him and his son just put out The Widening of God's Mercy. The Widening of God's Mercy. Okay, Richard Hayes. Richard B. Hayes, is an ethicist who wrote probably the most respected, if not one of the most respected, like New Testament ethics books that exist, taught in seminaries, all this stuff. I personally am affirming, like open and affirming LGBTQ.
Yeah, same here. Stuff. Not everyone on the
Richard show. Richard Hayes,
I am.
Right. And so Richard Hayes, when he wrote this book, was not, but he was like kind of the nicest version of non-affirming that you can get, in my opinion. Yeah. Still very harmful, still caused a lot of harm to people, right? And I don't want anyone to think I'm saying that he didn't do that. He recently wrote this book with this kid, The Widening of God's Mercy, where he basically is like, okay, I was wrong about LGBTQ stuff. And there was a really weird mixed feedback on this. And this is where I have to be careful because I can't speak. I'm not an LGBTQ person, so I can't speak for other people's experience here. But here's where I was frustrated. There were some people who said, fuck Richard Hayes and fuck this book. We don't need him to be saying these kind of things, da-da-da-da-da. He's already done so much harm. Now he thinks he can just say sorry and whatever. I understand the perspective, and I think that there are some people who that's true. That book wasn't written for them. I'm not going to give that to my LGBTQ friends who've been harmed by him. It's not necessary. However, there are people who are maybe on the fence and they really respect Richard Hayes, and that's a voice that means something to them. And this is what kind of pushes them over the line into becoming open and affirming, which I think, great. Yes, please. And so but to me, that's a harm reduction. That's like, I don't need him to be perfect and now he's the perfect ally and everything is great and he figured it all out. But if it can reduce harm and can reduce the harm of the LGBTQ community, I'm all for it. Again, I recognize I'm speaking out of a place of privilege. I am not LGBTQ, so I can't, speak for their experiences. But that's like kind of that tension. It's a risky example, but I hope it makes sense to listeners and whatever.
No, I'm with you. Richard Hayes is one. So just so people know, since for some reason, well, not for some reason, because of life choices I made, I've just become the church unity guy in a lot of circles. That's just, it's just like, oh, Josh is the unity guy. We'll ask him something. And I'm like, oh, fun. Usually it's stuff I don't know anything about. I'm like, the reason I'm the unity guy is because like I don't know anything. I could just ask anybody anything. But no, like I do a lot of reading, and usually a lot of the questions I get asked, it's because someone from one side or the other of any debate is like, well, I want to understand the other side more, but I picked up this book and it made me really mad, basically. So I do a lot of that where I'm like, if you want to understand the other side more, and I know you're not going to convert to the other side, here's one I think will be less offensive to you.
Yeah.
And I have one, I don't want to say the author or anything, but it's like Transforming Homosexuality. I won't go further than that because it was a book from that non-affirming perspective, and this was before I was affirming personally because I was in more recent development. That like I would open it and it infuriated me because I have loved ones who are LGBTQ. So even though I kind of agreed with them, like it was like sheep and the goat, and they're the goat, and I'm like, you know what? F you! I want to burn this book. Like I don't believe in burning books, but like screw this guy, right? And even to this day, I vehemently disagree with Kevin DeYoung. But when he writes it, he still takes that super conservative standpoint. But he's not an asshole about it. And sometimes it's just like not being an asshole is like a huge part of this. So like, yeah, I totally get what you mean. And like that's part of this story a little bit too, is where you're like, I don't know, like if I was to point to someone, like let's say if I'm talking to, because I know we have a lot of more conservative listeners who want to read the more progressive viewpoint of open and affirming, I'm probably going to point to Richard Hayes' new book. Now that I remember his name. Because that's one that he speaks their language a little bit, or I might even point to Poison Ivy, because even though they're not going to get any rich theology, it kind of gives you a perspective, and that's what Willow Wilson did with Miss Marvel too. It gave a perspective of what it's like to be a Muslim American in New Jersey, and here through Poison Ivy, you see what it's like to be a lesbian woman, and what's unique about both these characters. And Poison Ivy's point in time in this, is she's recently gotten into a same-sex relationship. I wonder, and of course these are characters that are not real, so how much thought can we prescribe to them? I don't know. But like I wonder how much of like Poison Ivy's mindset is, oh wait, I'm now an outcast. This girl froze to death for being an outcast. Like part of that is probably going through her head, and we're probably going to see some of that unpacked in the comics after this. And like that's kind of the perspective. Sometimes I feel like that's more powerful than theology. It's like, hey, what if you just read this comic? Like it's silly, but it's going to give you an inside look of like what it's like to just live as one of these people that you sometimes hate so much, right? And just see what it's like. And that's what's, you mentioned like the good guys, bad guys, like we like to divide. And that's what's interesting about this pairing. Swamp Thing is typically thought of as a good guy, but he's kind of a monster that occasionally causes people to just die for being in the forest. You're like, how good is that? And like Poison Ivy is usually like the bad guy. Like she fights Batman, but it's like, she's bad because she's trying to save the planet. So like, how bad is that? Like both of these characters are kind of like, I can't really good guy, bad guy, either of them.
Yeah. It's, I don't know, dude. I lost my train of thought, but I mean, I think I remember I think what you're talking about is story and relationship. It's really easy to demonize people or disagree with them or think that they're idiots for believing something when you don't have a relationship and you don't know somebody. But when you actually step into a relationship with somebody, that changes everything. Like when you're told, oh, all, like Muslim people are like this. And then you meet a Muslim and you're like, wait a minute, I was told that all of you guys are like this and you're not. Like those things break categories for people.
Yeah.
So I'm a huge proponent of story and of relationship. And I think also too, like, man, I'm going to do another theological thing
Go
here,
for it.
but Paul Tillich, who I like a lot, talks about symbols. And often people will critique Tillich and be like, oh, well, he just thinks all Christianity is symbolic, and that means he doesn't believe in it, blah, blah, blah. And Tillich himself would say, like, no, if you say something is just a symbol, you don't understand what symbols are. Because he draws this distinction between a symbol and a sign. And he, so like a sign, so like a stop sign, right? We see it, it's red, octagon says stop. We see it, it means stop, and that's it. That's what it does. A symbol participates in that which it points to. So a symbol is more than just a sign. Symbols are powerful, deeply powerful. And symbols is actually how, like, society runs on symbols and on story. Like, and I think something that's interesting is a lot of, if people are willing to admit it, the kind of religious symbols that have been prominent within culture are failing. They are not working for people anymore. And we have to reconcile with that. And I think to your point about like, oh, it's silly handing someone a comic. I don't think it's silly, because I think things like comic books and Marvel movies, they're offering other symbols to culture. And there's really good symbols in this Poison Ivy comic that are worthy of our finitude, that are worthy of the ultimate. And so I don't think it's silly. I think it's pretty cool. Anyway, that's now my defense of comic books, I guess, that I didn't know I was going to make.
No, I agree though, and
Yeah.
I think that's the thing, right? Is who knows what Poison Ivy story ends up being, and I believe in the story of Jesus personally. Like I believe in that story, but I could see a world where that story has been so tainted and people have such like preconceived notions about it, where I can't start with that story. You know, this is like the mitigating damages almost thing again, right?
Yeah, there you go.
like maybe instead I start with a story of Poison Ivy, someone who is constantly looked at as evil, who is both part of the green and not, and who knows what her story becomes. Maybe she transcends both things to be something more, and kind of seeing like how one person can be both and then transcend. Maybe eventually we work our way back to these stories that I do find so foundational. But maybe we have to start with stories that are more relevant for today's world, and maybe this is one of them.
Yeah. No, I feel you, dude. And I think what I would say, what you made me just think of, and I'm full credit. I'm ripping this off of somebody, and then I'm going to riff on it.
Perfect.
I had to attend a funeral recently on Saturday for a 2-week-old infant.
Oh, man.
And Father Derek, who you recently had on Whole Church podcast, performed the service. And within the Episcopal Church, funeral services are Easter services. They are hopeful and talk a lot about resurrection. And Derek made this really interesting point. He was like, look, I know it's probably weird. You guys, not all of you are Episcopalians, probably not even all Christians in this room. And you're like, Father Derek, you keep talking about all this resurrection stuff. And like, I can't believe that. I can't believe that today. That's not helpful. And from the pulpit, Father Derek said, you don't have to believe in resurrection to practice resurrection. I think that's the power. That's the power of symbol. That's the power of I think religion and Christianity, like the whole thing. You don't have to physically believe in the resurrection to go out and live as if resurrection is true, and to create resurrection in your life and in the lives of people around you. And I would argue that people that live out the resurrection, it's better to do that than to just believe it anyway. Paul said something about this, something about gongs, but anywho,
Yeah, it goes back to the faith and belief stuff.
Yeah, 100% it does. 100%. It's a disposition. It's a way of being in the world.
Yeah, which this whole comic's about life and death, so I feel like this is a good last note before I get to the final question. That's a lot easier, I promise.
Cool. Okay.
But just kind of thinking about like in the garden, going back to like Genesis. Clearly, when God said, "If you do this, you will die," He didn't mean they were going to drop dead in that instance, and that makes me wonder: was He talking about physical death at all? Like part of me is like, is that even what He meant? Because like death enters the world, and then with my Christology, Christ dies and raises again, and I don't think it's the death that paid price for sin. I think rather Christ defeated death in the grave and brought life back to everyone. And we could choose to participate in that resurrection. We could choose to participate in the Tao, love, divine, whatever. I tie it to the Jesus event, but whatever it is, I feel like that is something we can do. And my belief is all over the place sometimes. But my faith that that's something that matters. Yeah, that's just where I'm at. I know we see things a little bit differently sometimes, but I feel like we're kind of close on this one. I feel like we're pretty close.
Pretty similar. Yeah.
But
you probably have more. You probably have more. There are probably more metaphysical and ontological truth claims that you'd be comfortable making. That I think that's probably where the difference is. But I think the way we hold that is the same.
Yeah. No, that makes sense.
Yeah. And you're nice enough to be like, okay, Josh isn't completely crazy.
Yeah. Well, you usually make me think and then want to read more because you read more than me, which in my mind means you're smarter. I equate reading to smartness. I don't know. I know I have two notes that I need to ask Josh for. Let's see. I wrote it down. A book about anti-theodicy, because you mentioned that in this one. There was another one, but I didn't write it down. There was something else I wanted to ask you for a book for. I'll think about it. Oh, Theopoetics. Because I've been really interested in that, but I want the top Josh recommended book, but that'll be off the air, maybe. Cool.
Yeah. You can always text me too.
Yeah, because every now and then Josh just sends me good books, and I'm like, yeah, let me check this out, and then.
Yeah.
But last thing, I wanted to just say, what is our favorite character, panel, and line from the comic? And for me, it's somewhat easy, so I'll go first. For me, this is weird. My favorite character is either the girl who's not named or whose name I forgot. Just because they show you just enough of her life that you see this was a genuine human who desperately wanted to feel connection with others. And I don't know, something about the loss of that kind of character who just wanted to feel connection and the entanglement of it. I feel like that character drove the story. So for me, even though she got the least amount of time, I like that character a lot. This on the screen is my favorite panel. When you have Poison Ivy, which is also my favorite line, she's like, "This isn't how it was supposed to end." And Swamp Thing kind of trying to comfort her with some metaphysical promptings, I guess. Where he's like, that's what it is, though. We're all eventually return to the green. And I'm like, yeah. For some reason, this line, this panel, the way it was drawn even, because it's I don't think it was a half-page splash. I feel like it was a quarter page or a half page. But it was a pretty large panel, and you just see his face in the background, spotlight on Poison Ivy, holding this dead girl going, this wasn't how it was supposed to end. And I don't know, for me, it was the most relatable moment and probably the most powerful, just in my opinion. Josh, where are you at? Favorite character, panel, line?
Yeah, I think my favorite panel is definitely the final one that we kind of already talked about, where you see Swamp Thing carrying the girl. That's the one.
Yeah.
And I don't know why it stuck out to me when I read it. It continues to stand out to me. I've already talked about it, but I love the line where he says the green is a perspective.
Mm-hmm.
I think this whole ending sequence here is great. We're all walking toward death, but death is not the end. Death was never the end. I like this panel a lot. There's just so much to think about, to reflect on. The imagery is beautiful, of Swamp Thing kind of carrying the girl through the forest. And I can't. It was like kind of hard for me to decide because I guess out of the three characters, I like different aspects about all of them. I am drawn to the girl who died for very similar reasons that you mentioned. Um, I am drawn to Poison Ivy because she's the character that I relate the most to. In like, I feel like she's an empath in this particular comic, and she's driven a lot by the things she values, and that's kind of how I operate in the world, whether consciously or unconsciously.
Yeah, totally.
And Swamp Thing is super intriguing because it's almost like a voice of wisdom that I find some comfort in. It's challenging at times, but also comforting. And I think he cares for this girl in a different way than maybe Ivy does. So that's not really a straight answer. It's hard for me to choose a favorite.
No, I totally get that.
Yeah.
I kind of agree with everything you said. I just made myself pick a favorite.
What's a good one? You did a good job.
Yeah, I will say too, like with Swamp Thing in this, it's interesting. I feel like he was the closest to Taoism, so like it would probably be something I would expect myself to choose. But at the same time, like I don't know, I kind of got mad too, where I was like, why aren't you pissed off?
Yeah,
you know, like hold up. But also, close runner up for final line for me, that last line where he said, "Death was never the end." You know, in hindsight, now that I know more about his character, I'm like, he could have both been talking about himself or this girl or just in general. Like it works in so many ways. I'm like, that's a good ending to a story.
It is. Yeah, I agree. Well done.
Awesome stuff, man. Well, with that, I think we can go to wrap up here. And that was louder than I thought it would be. Yeah. Man, first thing first, though, we like to start a wrap up with a recommendation. I want to go first, but I don't remember what I was going to recommend. I knew it was something cool. I hate when this happens. You know what? I'm going to recommend something I already mentioned in another episode, but since I'm stalling, I'll just go ahead and recommend the Kamigawa Food Detectives. Super interesting little book, kind of interwoven short stories. A man and his daughter who find recipes for foods that people miss. Like my grandma used to make this kind of chicken, and they could do like such the detail, making sure they get the water from the right part of the country, making sure they get like the right kind of chicken broth, go to the right grocery store because you know the produce might taste slightly different, and like perfectly recreating these meals. And I don't know, I find it so interesting, and it could have been written in a way that was boring, but somehow the way that it like the writing is, it's really captivating. I love that. Josh, anything you would recommend to everybody?
Yeah, sure. I'm going to grab it off my shelf. I would recommend this little book called On Religion by John Caputo. It is fantastic. I don't know, it's kind of his excursus on religion, what religion is. I mean, he's in favor of it, but he definitely has some different perspectives. So I think it's worth checking out. It also, if you like or had your ears peaked by any of the kind of like radical theology stuff I was saying, Caputo is like my favorite radical theologian. So I would recommend this On Religion by Caputo.
Man, I have to check that out too. I always get like a whole like reading list every time I talk to Josh or listen to his podcast.
It's cool too because he builds like the book is built around the question, what do I love when I love my God, which is Augustine.
Oh, that's good.
So he's pulling heavily from Augustine, and he's asking that question, what do we love when we love our God? So
side note, if you haven't yet, I also recommend following Rethinking Faith podcast, and on my Amazon I have a whole separate like wish list that's just it's called Rethinking Faith, and it's just a list of books you mentioned that I'm like, I need to read these eventually.
Hell yeah.
Yeah,
that's awesome.
And with that, guys, I hope you all enjoyed a little bit of a longer episode, a little bit different than what we usually do. I feel like we don't usually go this much into a single issue, but I thought it was worth it. It was a fun time. Always fun talking to Josh. If you guys can like and subscribe on YouTube, 50 likes on any video, and we'll get a video of Will frolicking through flowers to throw up there. Also, thank you to our supporters, especially Russell Gentry, you rock. And remember, everyone, we're all the chosen people, a geekdom of priest.